In 2015, the town of Pine Hollow nestled among fields of golden corn stretching endlessly under the scorching sun of the American South. It was a small, quiet place where dusty red dirt roads kicked up clouds whenever a truck passed, where faded white wooden houses stood silently like ghosts of the past. The people here lived slowly, to the rhythm of early mornings filled with rooster crows and long afternoons on the porch, holding ice-cold glasses of lemonade. Pine Hollow was a typical American rural town where time seemed to stand still, where everything was familiar, the same. Everything except Jamal Carter. Jamal, a 15-year-old boy with skin as black as burnt coal, was a stray ink mark on the pristine white page of Pine Hollow. He lived with his mother, Lena Carter, in a rickety wooden house perched on the eastern edge of town, where the cornfields gave way to wild weeds and old oak trees stretched their skeletal branches like thin arms begging the sky for help. The house wasn't much to boast about. The rusty tin roof rattled whenever it rained. The loose wall planks revealed large gaps where the wind whistled through, carrying a sound like the mournful whisper of fate. But for Jamal and Lena, it was home, a place where they could lean on each other amidst the cold world outside. Lena was a small but sturdy woman, with hands as rough as tree bark from long years of working as a janitor at the local school. Every morning, she woke up before the sun rose, tied her silver-gray headscarf, and trudged down the red dirt road to Pine Hollow High. There, she knelt on the floor, scrubbing away every stain, every footprint left by the careless students. Sometimes, she looked up through the classroom window, saw Jamal sitting in the back corner of the room, and a faint smile appeared on her worn face. Jamal was all she had, the only hope in her tearful and weary life. Jamal was different. He was tall and thin, with legs as if born to run away from trouble, and eyes as bright as two lost stars in the dark night. He wasn't like the other kids in Pine Hollow, not just because of his skin color, but because of the way he saw the world. While the white kids in town spent their time throwing rocks into the river or hanging out on the basketball court after school, Jamal liked to sit under the big oak tree near his house, clutching an old notebook. The notebook was worn, the pages yellowed with age, but inside was a universe Jamal had created, scribbled lines about machines flying through the sky, skyscrapers touching the clouds, and big ideas he believed would one day change his life. "Mom, I'll get you out of here," he once told Lena, his voice as firm as a vow. She just smiled, patting his head, but in her eyes was a wordless sadness. She knew Pine Hollow wasn't a place for dreams like that. Pine Hollow was a white town, an unspoken truth, but everyone understood. The people here all had blonde or light brown hair, blue or gray eyes, and polite smiles reserved only for those like them. Jamal was the exception, the only black boy in the entire town, an oddity in the homogeneous picture they had painted for generations. He was unwelcome, always. From the first days he stepped into Pine Hollow High, he felt it not through blunt words, but through glances, gestures, the invisible spaces people created around him. At school, Jamal was a thorn in the side of the other students. He was smart, too smart for a town that didn't value a kid like him. In math class, when the teacher wrote a tricky problem on the board, a complex tangle of numbers and symbols, the whole class was silent. No one dared to raise their hand. Then Jamal, from the back corner of the room, coughed softly and gave the answer accurate, concise, without a hint of boasting. The teacher, Mrs. Thompson, a middle-aged woman with glasses perched on her nose, was momentarily surprised, but quickly turned back to the board as if unwilling to admit it. The students were different. They turned to look at him, not with admiration, but with a mix of annoyance and contempt. "He thinks he's better than us?" A kid named Billy, with messy blonde hair and a flat nose, whispered to his friends. Giggles rang out, soft but loud enough for Jamal to hear. He said nothing, just looked down at his notebook, continuing to draw a sketch of a suspension bridge he had read about in a science book at the library. The malicious pranks didn't stop there. During recess, when Jamal walked through the hallway, Billy and his friends deliberately slowed down, blocking his path. "Look at him, the dirty black kid," Billy sneered, shoving Jamal so hard he almost fell. The books in his hand fell to the floor, the sound of rustling paper echoing through the crowded hallway. The other kids burst out laughing, the laughter as sharp as the cawing of crows in the cornfields outside. Jamal didn't retaliate. He bent down, picked up each book, brushed the dust off the cover, and stood up, head held high. He didn't give them a reason to go further, but in his heart, an ember smoldered, small but never extinguished. The teachers weren't much better. Mrs. Thompson, with her monotonous voice and cold eyes, often ignored Jamal being bullied right in front of her. Once, when Billy threw a crumpled piece of paper at Jamal's head during class, she just shook her head slightly, as if his presence was a mistake that needed to be corrected. "Jamal, you should focus more," she said, her voice dry, even though he was one of the best students in the class. The other teachers were the same. They didn't openly discriminate, but the way they avoided eye contact, the way they called his name with a slight hesitation, as if the name Jamal Carter was something foreign, not belonging here, said it all. Outside of school, the town wasn't any more pleasant. When Jamal walked home along the main street, the adults sitting on their porches often stopped talking, watching him with wary eyes. Old Man Henry, the only grocer in town, always recounted the money whenever Jamal bought something, as if he would steal right in front of him. Mrs. Mary, the woman who often sat knitting in front of the church, once whispered to her neighbor as Jamal passed by, "His mother's a janitor, yet he dares to be so arrogant." Those words never reached Jamal directly, but he felt them through the way they tightened their wallets when he approached, through the way they turned their faces away as if he were a ghost that shouldn't exist. But Jamal didn't break. Every day, he returned to that rickety house, sat by the broken window, looking out at the cornfields stretching to the horizon. He opened his notebook, continued to write his dreams about a world where he wouldn't be judged by his skin color, where his mother wouldn't have to kneel on the floor to earn pennies, where he could stand tall and say, "I belong here." He didn't know that, in this very town, a conspiracy was quietly brewing, as silent as the wind blowing through the fields, but strong enough to sweep away everything he loved. That fateful day, under the gray sky of Pine Hollow, was closer than he thought the day his life would be torn apart by a shocking secret, and this town would never be the same again. That afternoon, the sky over Pine Hollow was as heavy as lead. Gray clouds rolled in from the south, obscuring the already weak October sun. The wind blew strongly through the cornfields, making the dry stalks rustle, as if they were whispering to each other about something about to happen. Jamal sat by the window of the wooden house, his notebook open on his lap, his hand quickly sketching an airplane with wings as smooth as a swallow's. He smiled a rare, small but warm smile, thinking about taking his mother away from this place one day, away from the contemptuous glances and malicious whispers. He didn't know that, at that very moment, another storm, more devastating than nature, was brewing right at his doorstep. The first sound he heard was the wail of a police siren, sharp, piercing, cutting through the silence of the afternoon. Jamal looked up, frowning, his heart beating a little faster. He stood up, walked out onto the porch, his bare feet touching the cold wooden floor. Through the broken glass of the window, he saw two police cars, red and blue lights flashing, stop in the yard. Red dust billowed as the wheels crunched on the dirt road. Four police officers stepped out, their faces as hard as stone, their hands resting on the holsters at their belts. Leading them was Fred Tucker, the chief of police of Pine Hollow, a large man with short gray hair and tiny eyes peeking out from under his hat. He never smiled, never spoke an unnecessary word, but every time Jamal saw him, he felt a cold shiver run down his spine. Jamal Carter. Tucker's voice rang out, deep and heavy like thunder. Come out here now. Jamal stood still, gripping the door frame, his mind reeling. He didn't understand what was happening. His mother, Lena, had just returned from work, still holding the old cloth bag with a few cans of soup from Henry's store. She hurried up the path leading to the house, her face creased with worry at the sight of the police. What's going on? She asked, her voice trembling, but no one answered her. They looked at her as if she didn't exist, their eyes passing over her like a ghost. Tucker didn't wait any longer. He stepped onto the porch, his shiny black shoes stomping on the wooden floor, making the whole house shake slightly. We received a report, he said, his voice monotonous but cold, about a gun in this house. Open the door, or we'll break it down. Jamal felt the blood in his veins freeze. A gun? He had never seen anything like that in the house, never touched it. He turned to his mother, his eyes wide, but Lena was just as bewildered, her hands trembling, dropping the bag to the ground. The cans of soup rolled across the floor, making a dry, clattering sound. What are you talking about? Jamal spoke up, his voice lost in shock. We don't have a gun. You're mistaken. But Tucker didn't bother to look at him. He signaled to the other two officers, and they stormed into the house like a whirlwind, without a warrant, without an explanation. The sound of shoes stomping on the floor, the sound of furniture being shoved aside echoed through the small house. Lena screamed, rushing to stop them, but an officer pushed her down onto a chair, hard enough to almost knock her to the floor. Don't touch my mother, Jamal yelled, lunging forward, but Tucker blocked him, his large hand like a vice gripping his shoulder, holding him still. Just a few minutes later, though, to Jamal, it felt like a lifetime. An officer emerged from his small bedroom, holding something wrapped in an old shirt. He opened it, and the metal gleamed in the dim afternoon light. An old revolver, rusty at the barrel, but enough to make Jamal's world collapse. Found it, the officer said, his voice triumphant, showing it to Tucker. He looked at the gun, then turned to Jamal, his tiny eyes now flashing with something not surprise, not doubt, but satisfaction. This is yours, isn't it? Tucker asked, but it wasn't a real question. His voice was already accusatory. Jamal shook his head violently, tears streaming down his face uncontrollably. No, I swear I've never seen it. Someone put it there. I didn't do anything. He turned to his mother, hoping she would believe him, but Lena just sat there, her hands covering her face, sobbing. The despair in her eyes was like a knife stabbing into Jamal's heart. The rumor spread faster than wildfire across a dry field. Before the police could take Jamal to the car, neighbors had gathered in the yard, familiar faces he saw every day, now twisted with anger and fear. Old man Henry from the grocery store stood there, hands on his hips, muttering, I knew it, that kid was always trouble. Mrs. Mary, the woman who often knitted, clutched her crucifix, whispering to the person next to her, he was going to shoot someone, I'm sure of it. Those words, though small, all reached Jamal's ears, each sentence like a hammer blow to his self-esteem. You're wrong, Jamal shouted, his voice breaking, as Tucker pulled him out of the house. I didn't do anything. I don't have a gun. But no one listened. They didn't want to listen. To them, Jamal was already a criminal before this happened, not because of evidence, but because of who he was, because of his skin color, because he dared to dream in a place that didn't accept dreams from people like him. Tucker pushed him into the back of the police car. The door slammed shut, the sound of metal clanging like an end to his life in Pine Hollow. Lena ran after them, pounding on the car window, crying and begging. "He's my son. He didn't do anything. Please let him go." But the car was already rolling, red dust billowing, obscuring her figure. Through the rearview mirror, Jamal saw his mother collapse in the yard, her shoulders shaking, her sobs blending with the wind. That was the last image he saw before the car turned onto the main road, taking him to the police station, a small, dilapidated building in the middle of town, where his fate would be decided without regard for the truth. At the station, there was no real interrogation. Tucker sat across from Jamal in a small room, the walls stained with yellow spots, the fluorescent light flickering on the ceiling. He placed the gun on the table right in front of him and growled, "Tell me, where did you get this? What were you planning to do with it?" Jamal shook his head, tears streaming down his cheeks, his voice hoarse. "I don't know. I swear to you, I don't know where it came from. Someone put it in my house." But Tucker just sneered, a twisted, cold smile. "You think I believe those lies? A kid like you, living here, always sneaking around like a thief, I know you have bad intentions." Jamal wanted to scream, wanted to bang on the table, wanted to do anything to prove his innocence, but he knew it was useless. In Tucker's eyes and the eyes of the whole town, he was guilty from the start. From the day he was born with black skin in a place that only accepted white. There was no other evidence, no witnesses, no fingerprints, just an anonymous accusation over the phone. And that was enough. Tucker stood up, stuffed the gun into a plastic bag, then turned to the officer standing by the door. "Recorded in the report. Jamal Carter in possession of an illegal weapon. Take him away." That night, Jamal sat in the small cell, his head in his hands, tears soaking his shirt. He didn't understand what was happening, didn't understand who had done this, didn't understand why his life had shattered in just a few hours. He thought of his mother, thought of the notebook now lying somewhere in the ransacked belongings, thought of the dreams now trampled under the heels of hatred. But he didn't know that, behind it all, a bigger secret was hiding, a conspiracy orchestrated by the very people he saw every day. The people who had decided that a smart black boy was an unforgivable threat. And that secret, like an ember under the ashes, would burn fiercely a decade later, when Jamal returned to claim justice. The night in the cell passed like a never-ending nightmare. Jamal huddled on the cold iron bed, the thin blanket not enough to ward off the bone-chilling cold of October. The fluorescent light on the ceiling flickered constantly, casting faint streaks of light on his face, making his tear-reddened eyes look like two bottomless pits. The sound of water dripping from the wash basin in the corner of the room echoed rhythmically tick-tock, tick-tock like a countdown to a sentence he didn't deserve. He hugged his head, trying to recall every moment of the previous afternoon, trying to find a clue, a reason, anything to explain why that gun appeared in his house. But it was all a thick fog, and in that fog, he saw only the image of his mother collapsing in the yard, crying out his name. The next morning, as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the small barred window, the sound of the door lock echoed dryly. Fred Tucker stepped in, his shiny black shoes gleaming in the light, his face as cold as a stone in the field. "Get up," he ordered, his voice deep and sharp, devoid of emotion. Jamal looked up, his eyes swollen, his lips cracked from hunger and thirst. "Am I going home yet?" he asked, his voice weak, his hope as fragile as a passing breeze. But Tucker just looked at him, his tiny eyes flashing with contempt. "Home? You don't have a home here anymore, kid. The people want you gone, and I'll make sure of it." Before Jamal could understand, two other officers stepped in, one holding handcuffs, the other gripping his arm, pulling him to his feet. "What's happening?" he yelled, struggling, but the strength of a 15-year-old boy was no match for their iron grip. "Where's my mother? I want to see my mother." Tucker turned his back, not answering, just signaling for them to take him out. As the cell door opened, the noise from outside flooded in shouts, the sound of feet stomping on the ground, the wind carrying red dust. Jamal felt his heart pounding, a dark premonition gripping his chest. They took him to the front yard of the police station, and the scene before him left him speechless. Dozens, no, hundreds of people had gathered there, their faces twisted with anger, their eyes wild like those of predators. They were the people he saw every day. Old man Henry from the grocery store, Mrs. Mary from the church, Billy and his classmates. Even Mrs. Thompson, his teacher, stood among the crowd with her lips pressed tightly. They held stones, wooden sticks, some held up signs scribbled with black ink. "Get him out of here. An no room for criminals." The roar of the crowd was like a tidal wave, washing away any remaining hope in Jamal's heart. "Dirty black kid," a man yelled, his voice hoarse with rage. "Who are you planning to kill?" Another woman screamed, pointing at him as if he were the embodiment of evil. Jamal shook his head, tears streaming down his face again, but this time he couldn't speak. His voice was choked, his throat as dry as a desert. He just wanted to scream that he was innocent, that it was all a terrible mistake, but his cries were drowned out by the noise of the crowd, by the hatred that filled the air. Then he saw his mother. Lena pushed through the crowd, her small hands shoving people aside, her face wet with tears and sweat. "Jamal," she called, her voice breaking, trying to reach him. But Tucker blocked her, his large hand gripping her shoulder, pushing her to the ground. "Mom," Jamal screamed, lunging towards her, but the two officers held him back, their grip so tight it hurt. Lena knelt on the ground, her hands clutching the red dust, crying and begging. "He's my son. You can't do this. He didn't do anything." She raised her hand towards Tucker, her voice trembling. "Please, Mr. Fred, I've known you for a long time. You know he's not that kind of person." But Tucker just looked at her, his eyes as cold as ice. "You should have taught your son better, Lena," he said, his voice monotonous but sharp as a knife. "Now it's too late." He turned to the crowd, raised his hand, and the shouting subsided for a moment. "The people have decided," he announced, his voice echoing across the yard. "Jamal Carter is a danger to Pine Hollow. He will leave here today. No court, no paperwork, we don't want his kind here." Cheers erupted, deafening. Jamal felt his legs trembling, not with fear, but with the overwhelming feeling of helplessness. He looked at his mother, saw her kneeling there, her hands covering her face, crying until she had no more tears. He wanted to run to her, wanted to tell her he would be okay, that he would find a way to come back, but he didn't have a chance. A stone flew through the air, grazing his shoulder, leaving a red welt. Then another stone and another. The crowd started throwing stones, not hard enough to kill, but enough to hurt him, enough to send the message, "You don't belong here." "Put him on the bus," Tucker ordered, and the two officers dragged Jamal to the main road, where an old bus was waiting. It wasn't a police car, but an inner-city bus with faded green paint and scratched patches. The driver, a middle-aged man with an emotionless face, leaned against the bus door, smoking a cigarette, as if this was nothing unusual. Jamal was pushed onto the bus, his hands still cuffed, and fell into a seat near the window. He looked out, saw the crowd still gathered, saw the stones scattered on the ground, saw his mother being held back by two women as she tried to run after him. "Mom," he yelled, pounding on the window, but the bus started, the engine roaring, drowning out his voice. Through the dirty glass, he saw Lena struggling, screaming his name, her disheveled hair flying in the wind. Old man Henry stepped forward, raised his hand, and slapped her, knocking her to the ground. "Shut up, you filth!" he shouted, and the crowd burst out laughing. The laughter as sharp as a knife cutting into Jamal's heart. He pounded on the glass, tears streaming down his face, but the bus didn't stop. It rolled away, taking him away from Pine Hollow, away from his mother, away from the rickety house he once called home. On the bus, Jamal huddled, holding the small backpack, the only thing they allowed him to take. Inside were a few changes of clothes, a pencil, and his precious notebook, miraculously not confiscated in the chaos. He opened it, trembling, looking at the drawings, the words he had written about his dreams. But now, those dreams seemed so far away, like stars in the sky he could never reach. Tears fell onto the pages, blurring the ink, but he didn't wipe them away. He left them there, as a reminder of this day, the day he was driven out of his own life. The bus passed through the cornfields, past the small river where he used to fish, past the red dirt roads he used to walk to school. Each scene passed like a cut, separating him from the past. Jamal looked out the window, saw the silhouette of Pine Hollow shrink, then disappear behind the trees. He thought of his mother, thought of the slap she had received, thought of her last words. "Jamal, I love you." He clutched the notebook, whispering to himself, "I'll be back, Mom. I swear." But he didn't know that this day wasn't just the day he was expelled. It was the beginning of a longer tragedy than he imagined, a chain of dominoes that Pine Hollow's own hatred had pushed over. As the bus turned onto the highway, taking him to a strange place, Jamal had no idea that the next decade would be a journey filled with blood and tears, and that one day he would return, not as a rejected boy, but as a storm that would sweep away everything Pine Hollow once believed in. The bus rolled down the highway, the engine roaring like a final farewell to Pine Hollow. Jamal huddled in his seat by the window, his thin arms clutching the small backpack, the last remnants of his old life. Through the dirty glass, he watched the cornfields gradually give way to empty stretches of land, cold steel bridges, and finally, the skyscrapers looming on the horizon. The bus stopped at a rundown bus station on the outskirts of Atlanta, where the air was thick with the smell of gasoline and the sound of blaring horns replaced the tranquility of the town he once lived in. Jamal stepped down, his bare feet trembling on the cold concrete, and for the first time in his life, he felt truly without a place to belong. Jamal's distant Aunt Ruth was the only person he could turn to. Ruth was Lena's younger sister, but they rarely kept in touch. Lena had told him that Ruth left Pine Hollow when she was young, fleeing discrimination and malicious whispers to find a new life in the city. Jamal had only met her once when he was little, and his only memory was of a tall, thin woman with short, curly hair and a warm voice. Now, when Ruth appeared at the bus station, Jamal almost didn't recognize her. She was older than he remembered, her hair streaked with gray, her tired eyes hidden behind thick glasses, but when she looked at him, a sad smile flickered across her face. "Jamal," she said, her voice hoarse, "you've grown so much." Ruth took Jamal to a small apartment in a poor neighborhood of Atlanta. The apartment was on the third floor of an old building, the walls stained with cracks, the stairs creaking with every step. Inside, the smell of dampness mixed with the smell of frying oil from the tiny kitchen where Ruth worked part-time at a fast food restaurant to make a living. "It's not a big house," she said as she opened the door, her voice tinged with embarrassment, "but it's my home." "Now it's your home too." Jamal nodded, saying nothing, just quietly placing his backpack in the corner of the room. He was given a folding bed in the corner, by the window overlooking the noisy street below, where the sounds of car horns and street kids never stopped. The first days in Atlanta were another nightmare. Jamal no longer went to school. He couldn't go back after what happened in Pine Hollow, couldn't bear the prying eyes or the whispers behind his back. Instead, he looked for work, anything to avoid living off Ruth forever. He started by washing dishes in a small diner near his apartment, standing for hours at the sink, his hands submerged in cold soapy water, his back aching from constant bending. The owner, a middle-aged man with a pot-belly and a grumpy voice, often yelled at him, "Hurry up, kid. You're as slow as a turtle, and you dare to work?" Jamal didn't answer, just gritted his teeth, continuing to wash, water splashing on his clothes, soaking him in sweat and humiliation. But the humiliation wasn't the worst. In Atlanta, Jamal thought he would escape the discrimination that had weighed him down in Pine Hollow, but he was wrong. Although the neighborhood had more black people, there were still suspicious glances, veiled words whenever he passed by. Once, when he bought something at a convenience store near his apartment, the cashier, a white man with greasy hair, looked him up and down, his hand hovering near the cash register as if ready to call the police. "You got money?" he asked, his voice condescending. Jamal nodded, placing the crumpled bills on the counter. But the man still counted them slowly, as if Jamal were a thief waiting for an opportunity. Jamal left the store, clutching the bag tightly, his heart heavy. He realized that, no matter where he went, his skin color was still an unspoken sentence. The long nights in Atlanta were when Jamal faced himself. When Ruth was asleep, he sat by the window, opening his old notebook, the only thing left from Pine Hollow. Under the dim yellow streetlight, he looked at the drawings, the words he had written with burning hope. But now they seemed distant, like the dreams of someone else. He continued to write, but not about airplanes or skyscrapers anymore. He wrote about Pine Hollow, about the gun he never owned, about Fred Tucker's cold eyes, about his mother's cries as he was dragged away. "Who did this to me?" he wrote, his handwriting trembling. "Why do they hate me so much?" But the notebook didn't answer, and those questions lingered in his mind, like ghosts that never left. Then, one day, a bombshell hit. More than a year after Jamal left Pine Hollow, Ruth came home with red eyes, clutching her old phone. "Jamal," she called, her voice choked. "There's something about your mother." Jamal jumped up, his heart pounding, a dark premonition gripping his chest. "What happened to Mom?" he asked, his voice lost. Ruth sat down, pulling him beside her, and recounted what she had just heard from an old friend from Pine Hollow. Lena had passed away not from an accident, not from old age, but from an illness no one knew exactly. People said she had fallen apart after the day Jamal was expelled, that she worked herself to exhaustion, that she was so ostracized by the townspeople that no one helped her when she fell ill. She died alone, Ruth whispered, tears falling onto her trembling hands. She called your name until the end. Jamal heard, but didn't hear. His ears rang, his eyes blurred, and then he collapsed to the floor, sobbing like a child. His cries echoed in the small apartment, blending with the sounds of traffic outside. But no one heard, no one cared. He hugged the notebook, his hands clenched so tightly that his nails dug into his skin, blood dripping onto the floor. "Mom," he screamed, his voice breaking, but Lena was no longer there to answer. Her last image collapsing in the yard, crying out his name, flashed vividly, like a knife stabbing into his heart again. From that day on, Jamal changed. He still worked, still lived, but inside him was a void that nothing could fill. He quit washing dishes, moved on to heavier work loading cargo at the docks, where he had to carry heavy crates under the scorching Atlanta sun. His hands were calloused, his back ached, but he didn't care. Physical pain was the only way to forget the pain in his heart, the pain of losing his mother, the pain of being framed, the pain of being driven out of his own life. His co-workers, mostly older men with worn faces, rarely spoke, only occasionally asking, "Where are you from, kid?" Jamal didn't answer. He didn't want to tell, didn't want to remember. But at night, when everything was quiet, Jamal opened his notebook again. He no longer wrote about dreams now. He wrote about justice. One day, he scribbled, his handwriting sharp as a knife, "I'll be back. I'll make them pay for Mom, for me, for everything." That vow, though small on the page, was the only flame still burning in him, an ember, patient, waiting for the day it would erupt into a storm. He didn't know who had put the gun in his house, didn't know why they did it, but he swore he would find out the truth, no matter how long it took, no matter how much he had to sacrifice. Jamal's life in exile stretched through long years. He grew up amidst the dust and noise of Atlanta, from an innocent 15-year-old boy to a 25-year-old man with cold eyes and a hardened heart. He no longer dreamed of airplanes or skyscrapers. His dream was now the day he would return to Pine Hollow, not to beg for forgiveness, but to confront those who had shattered his and his mother's lives. And when that day came, that town would never have guessed that the boy they had expelled had become a man they couldn't underestimate. 10 years passed like a cold wind blowing through the dusty streets of Atlanta, carrying with it fragments of memories and leaving behind a completely different Jamal Carter. In 2025, Pine Hollow still stood, amidst fields of scorched yellow corn and red dirt roads now faded with time. The small town hadn't changed much. The white wooden houses were still weathered under the sun. The rooster crows still echoed every morning, and familiar faces still gathered on the porches, sipping lemonade and telling old stories. But one thing had changed. The name Jamal Carter was almost erased from their memories, remaining only as a faint ghost, a cautionary tale whispered on winter evenings. Remember that black kid who caused trouble? Old Man Henry, now older with white hair, would say to his friends in the grocery store, "Good thing he's gone. His kind doesn't belong here." They didn't know that, in that decade of silence, Jamal hadn't disappeared. He lived, he grew up, and he changed not in the eyes of Pine Hollow, but in the shadows of a world hundreds of miles away. In Atlanta, Jamal was no longer the skinny boy clutching a notebook full of dreams. Now, he was a 25-year-old man, tall, broad-shouldered, with cold eyes that hid an inextinguishable fire. Life in exile had forged him into a different person, his hands calloused from years of loading cargo at the docks, his face angular with a few small scars from inevitable street brawls, and a heart that no longer easily opened to anyone. After his mother's death, Jamal lived with Ruth for a few more years, but the pain of losing Lena turned him into a silent shadow in that small apartment. Ruth, with her warm heart but failing health, tried to pull him out of the abyss. "You have to go on, Jamal," she would say, her hand trembling on his shoulder. "Lena wouldn't want to see you like this." But Jamal didn't answer, just nodded, his eyes gazing out at the noisy street outside. When Ruth passed away from heart disease in the 5th year of his exile, Jamal officially became a loner. He sold the apartment, moved to a cheap room in the slums, and continued to do hard labor loading, cleaning, anything to keep his body busy and his mind from drifting to the past. But the past never left him. Every night, when the street noise subsided, Jamal sat at the old wooden table in his room, opening the notebook, now so worn it was almost torn. The drawings of airplanes and skyscrapers have been replaced by sharp, haunting lines. Fred Tucker. The gun. Pine Hollow. Mom. He wrote them over and over, like a curse, like a reminder that he was not allowed to forget. Under the dim light of the ceiling bulb, he sketched out plans vague, incomplete, but enough to keep the fire in him burning. "I'll find out the truth," he whispered to himself, his voice deep and firm as a vow carved in stone. That decade wasn't just a time for Jamal to survive, it was a time for him to learn how to exist, how to turn pain into strength. He quit his job as a loader when his body couldn't take it anymore, moved on to working as a security guard at a rundown bar near the bus station. The job didn't pay much, but it gave him the opportunity to observe, listen, and learn from the people he once thought only existed in books. Con artists, smugglers, cheap lawyers wandering in the city's shadows. From them, Jamal learned how to read people, how to detect lies in their eyes, how to patiently wait for an opportunity. He didn't talk much, didn't make friends, but he listened, and every small piece of information was a brick building the plan he nurtured in his heart. Pine Hollow, meanwhile, continued its life as if Jamal had never existed. Fred Tucker retired a few years after the incident, leaving the police chief's chair to a younger man, but still with the town's old-fashioned mindset. He moved to a small house by the river, living on his pension and boasting about his heyday. The townspeople still gathered at church every Sunday, still drank lemonade on the porch every afternoon, and still whispered about that black kid as a distant legend. Mrs. Thompson still taught math at Pine Hollow High, her hair now white, but her cold eyes unchanged. Billy, the kid who used to push Jamal in the hallway, now worked at his father's garage, his face flushed with alcohol and his belly bloated with beer. They lived, they laughed, they forgot, but Jamal didn't. On a cold winter day in 2025, Pine Hollow welcomed a strange guest. A shiny black car, a rare sight in this town, quietly stopped in front of the town hall. The man who stepped out of the driver's seat was unlike anyone they had ever met. Tall, wearing a tailored black suit, carrying a leather briefcase. He wore a fedora hat that covered half his face, but the sharp eyes that flashed under the brim were enough to make anyone who looked at them feel a cold shiver run down their spine. He walked slowly, his leather shoes tapping on the sidewalk, and said nothing as he passed Old Man Henry, standing in front of the grocery store. The old man watched him, frowning, whispering to himself, "Looks familiar, but who is he?" That man was Jamal Carter, no longer the skinny boy expelled 10 years ago, but a man with a clear purpose. He didn't go straight to his old house, didn't visit his mother's grave. He rented a small house on the outskirts of town, where the weeds grew waist-high and no one paid attention. He put the briefcase down on the table, opened it, and took out the notebook, the one that had accompanied him through a decade of exile. Inside, besides the old lines, there were now new notes. Dates, names, locations, all written in black ink. The handwriting is hard as cold steel. He sat down, looked out the window at the cornfield, now yellowed with winter, and smiled a smile without warmth, but full of meaning. The townspeople began to notice him after a few days. Jamal appeared in public places, the grocery store, the small cafe, even the church, but he said nothing beyond polite greetings. He always wore a suit, always carried the briefcase, and always kept an enigmatic smile on his lips. "Who is he?" Mrs. Mary whispered to her neighbor as she saw him walk past the church, hands in his pockets. "Looks like a city slicker," someone else replied, suspiciously. "Probably some investor looking to buy land here." But no one guessed the truth. No one recognized those eyes, the eyes that had looked at them with fear and tears 10 years ago. Jamal wasn't in a hurry. He knew the decade of silence had given him an advantage. Surprise. He spent the first days observing, memorizing the faces, voices, habits of the people who had expelled him. Old Man Henry still counted money as slowly as ever. Mrs. Thompson still walked with a stiff posture. Billy still yelled in the garage with a mouthful of beer. And Fred Tucker, he was still alive, still breathing, still telling old stories as if he had never ruined anyone's life. Jamal watched them from afar, his hands clenched in his pockets, but he didn't act. Not yet. The decade of silence wasn't a time for Jamal to run away, it was a time for him to prepare. In his years in Atlanta, he had taught himself, had read books, had learned about the law and how the world worked. He had no degrees, no money, but he had patience and a sharp mind that Pine Hollow had once underestimated. Now he was back, not as a victim, but as someone holding the reins. He knew the truth about the gun was somewhere in the shadows of this town, and he would bring it to light not with pleas, but with the strength that the decade of silence had forged in him. As night fell over Pine Hollow, Jamal sat in the small house, the flickering oil lamp casting shadows on his face. He opened a notebook, wrote a final line. Tomorrow it all begins. He closed the notebook, stood up, looked out at the darkness outside. This town had forgotten him, but he hadn't forgotten them. And tomorrow, they would remember not with pity, but with astonishment and fear. The winter of 2025 draped Pine Hollow in a thick fog, obscuring the wooden roofs and dimming the weak streetlights. This small town, accustomed to silence and uneventful days, suddenly became agitated by the appearance of a stranger. Jamal Carter, now a tall figure in a sleek black suit, had returned to the land that once expelled him, but no one recognized him. 10 years was long enough to erase the image of the skinny boy with fearful eyes from their minds, and Jamal knew it. He didn't come with noise or fanfare. He came in silence, like a cold wind seeping through the cracks of the town, carrying the promise of an impending storm. In the early days, Jamal didn't rush to reveal his identity. He rented a small house on the outskirts, a desolate place with stained walls and overgrown weeds, and turned it into his temporary shelter. The house had no electricity, only an old oil lamp flickering on the wooden table. But for Jamal, that was enough. He didn't need comfort. He needed silence to observe, to plan, to wait for the perfect moment. Every morning, he left the house with his black leather briefcase in hand, walking slowly through the red dirt roads now muddy with winter rain. He appeared at Henry's grocery store, at the small cafe where farmers gathered, and even at church on Sundays, but he didn't say much. Just a polite nod, an enigmatic smile, and sharp eyes scanning every face he met. The townspeople began to notice. Old man Henry, with his dim old eyes, stood behind the counter, watching Jamal choose a loaf of bread and a can of black coffee. "Where are you from?" the old man asked, his voice suspicious and curious. Jamal looked up, his eyes flashing under the brim of his fedora. "Far away," he replied, his voice deep and even without emotion. Henry frowned, counting the money slowly as was his habit, but didn't ask further. Mrs. Mary, the woman who often knitted in front of the church, whispered to her neighbor as she saw Jamal pass by, "Look at the way he walks, as if he owns this whole town." Whispers spread quickly, but no one dared to confront him directly. There was something in Jamal's demeanor, in the way he kept silent, that made them feel uneasy. Jamal enjoyed the curiosity, though he didn't show it. He knew they didn't recognize him. How could they? The boy they had stoned, had shouted venom at, was now a man with broad shoulders and a steady walk. 10 years of exile in Atlanta had forged him into a different person, not just in appearance, but in spirit. He was no longer the Jamal of naive dreams. He was the Jamal of patience and revenge, a man who knew that silence could be more terrifying than any words. Then one evening, the opportunity he had been waiting for arrived. The town council held a regular meeting at the town hall, an old building with red brick walls and dusty windows. It was where the townspeople gathered to discuss trivial matters, road repairs, budget allocations, or complaints about the harvest. Jamal knew this was the time to step into the light, not with a shout, but with an undeniable presence. He put on his black suit, wore leather gloves, and entered the hall as the meeting had already begun. The noise of the crowd laughter, arguments suddenly stopped as the creaking door opened. More than 50 pairs of eyes turned to look at him, from farmers with calloused hands to housewives with curious eyes. Jamal didn't rush. He walked into the middle of the hall, his leather shoes tapping on the wooden floor, his footsteps echoing in the silent space. He stopped at the back row, put down his briefcase, and sat down as if he belonged there. Fred Tucker, now retired, but still attending as a voice of the people, sat in the front row, turning to look at him. His tiny eyes narrowed, as if trying to remember something, but then he turned away, shrugging as if he didn't care. Mrs. Thompson, her white hair neatly tied, whispered to the person next to her, "Who is he?" No one answered, but the atmosphere in the hall began to feel heavy, as if a storm was brewing that they couldn't see. The meeting continued, but Jamal's presence made everything different. The moderator, Mr. James, a middle-aged man with a monotonous voice, read the budget report, but his voice faltered, his eyes occasionally glancing towards Jamal. The townspeople began to whisper, unspoken questions hanging in the air. What does he want? What is he doing here? Jamal said nothing, just sat there, his hands clasped, his eyes scanning every face like a hunter observing his prey. He recognized them, all of them, the people who had stood in the crowd 10 years ago, who had thrown stones, who had shouted curses. But they didn't recognize him, and that made him smile, a small, discreet smile, but full of meaning. When the discussion opened, Jamal stood up. The dry creak of the wooden chair broke the silence, and the whole hall turned to look at him again. He stepped forward, not fast, not slow, each step a countdown to the moment he had waited for a decade. He stopped in the middle of the hall, right in front of the council table, and spoke, his voice deep, clear, echoing to every corner of the room. "May I say a few words?" he said, his voice not loud, but enough to make everyone listen. Mr. James hesitated, looking to Tucker for guidance. Tucker shrugged, his thin lips pressed into a straight line. "Let him speak," he growled, "see what he wants." Jamal nodded, unfazed, and turned to the crowd. The fluorescent light on the ceiling shone down on his face, highlighting his sharp eyes and the hard lines that had replaced the innocence of the boy he once was. "I am Jamal Carter," he said, each word like a stone thrown into still water. "I used to live here, and I'm back to claim the truth." The hall fell silent. For a few seconds, no one spoke, no one moved, as if time had stopped. Then the whispering erupted, like a fire spreading across a dry field. "Jamal Carter?" Mrs. Mary whispered, clutching her chest, the crucifix on her neck swaying. "That kid is back?" Another man shouted, his voice mixed with confusion and anger. Fred Tucker sat up straight, his eyes narrowed, his hands gripping the armrests until his knuckles turned white. He said nothing, but his eyes, the eyes that had coldly condemned Jamal 10 years ago, now flashed with something else: unease. Jamal didn't give them time to react further. 10 years ago, he continued, his voice even but sharp as a knife, "You drove me away. You called me a criminal, threw stones at me, pushed my mother to the ground. You believed I owned a gun, something I never touched." He paused, looking straight at the crowd, his eyes lingering on every face he recognized. Old Man Henry, Mrs. Thompson, Billy, now a man with a pot belly and red eyes. "I'm not here to beg for forgiveness," he said, his voice dropping, but to make you face what you did. The shouting erupted like a violent wave. You're lying. A man yelled, jumping to his feet. You're a danger, and you always will be. Another woman screamed, pointing at him. But Jamal didn't flinch. He stood there, tall and still, like a steel statue in a storm. He raised his hand, signaling for silence. And strangely, the crowd quieted not because they wanted to, but because there was something in his eyes that made them unable to continue. I don't need you to believe me, he said, his voice cold but firm. The truth will speak for itself, and it will start here. He turned his back, walked out of the hall, leaving the crowd in chaos. Shouts and arguments echoed behind him, but he didn't look back. As the door slammed shut behind him, Jamal stood in the night air, his breath mingling with the cold fog. He knew he had just dropped a bomb in the heart of Pine Hollow, not with explosives, but with words, and now it was time to wait for it to explode. He wasn't in a hurry. He had waited 10 years, and a few more days were nothing to him. In the darkness, Jamal smiled a smile without warmth, but full of meaning. His return was not just an act, it was a declaration of war. And Pine Hollow, though unaware, had entered a battle they couldn't win. After the town council meeting, Pine Hollow fell into a state of simmering chaos. The winter wind whistling through the town's cracks couldn't drown out the whispers spreading from house to house. The name Jamal Carter, once buried in oblivion, now became the center of every conversation. At the cafe, farmers sat around the old wooden table, holding cold cups of coffee, muttering to each other. What's he back for? What does he want here? At the church, Mrs. Mary clutched her crucifix, praying in a trembling voice, Lord, don't let him bring trouble again. And at the garage, Billy, now a burly man with oil-stained hands, slammed a wrench on the table, growling. Who does that kid think he is? I'll teach him a lesson if he dares to come near here. But Jamal didn't rush to appear again. He hid in the small house on the outskirts, letting the town stew in its confusion and suspicion. Every night, under the flickering oil lamp, he opened his black leather briefcase not to retrieve papers or documents, but to check a small device he had brought from Atlanta, an old tape recorder, its casing scratched but still functional. Inside, it was the key to everything a tape he had spent nearly 10 years searching for, the final piece of the puzzle that Pine Hollow had tried to bury. Jamal held it in his hand, his fingers tracing the cold metal casing, and whispered to himself, now is the time. The next day, a notice was posted on the bulletin board in front of the town hall. An emergency meeting would be held on Saturday evening, and all residents were required to attend. No one knew who had written the notice. Mr. James, the council moderator, swore he had no involvement, but everyone guessed it was related to Jamal. Rumors spread quickly, and as the sun set behind the yellowed cornfields, the town hall was packed. The atmosphere was heavy, suffocating, as if the whole town was holding its breath, waiting for something they didn't want to face. Jamal entered the hall on time, not a minute early, not a second late. He still wore the black suit, carrying the briefcase, but this time without the fedora hat covering his face. He revealed his hard features, completely sharp eyes, tightly pressed lips, and a small scar on his left cheek, a mark of his years in exile. Whispers arose as he entered, but he didn't look at anyone. He walked straight to the front, stood in the middle of the hall, facing the now silent crowd. Fred Tucker sat in the front row, his hands clasped, his face tense, but still maintaining a facade of composure. Mr. James stood at the council table, his voice trembling as he spoke. Are here today to hear Mr. Carter speak. He requested this. Jamal nodded, put the briefcase on the floor, and spoke, his voice deep, clear, echoing to every corner of the room. 10 years ago, he began, you drove me out of Pine Hollow. You believed I owned a gun, something I had never seen before the police found in my house. You called me a criminal, threw stones at me, pushed my mother to the ground, and didn't give me a chance to explain. He paused, his eyes scanning the crowd, lingering on each familiar face. Old Man Henry, Mrs. Thompson, Billy, and finally Tucker. Today, I'm here to tell the truth, not to make you believe, but to make you unable to deny. Whispers rose again, but Jamal raised his hand, signaling for silence. He opened the briefcase, took out the old tape recorder, and placed it on the council table. The crowd held its breath, eyes fixed on him, no one knowing what he was about to do. This is what I found after 10 years, he said, his voice dropping, a recording made a few days before I was expelled. It wasn't easy to get. I had to search through the dark corners of Atlanta, meet people I never wanted to meet just to get it. And now, you will listen. He pressed the play button. A small static sound came from the recorder. Then a familiar voice spoke, deep, hoarse, unmistakable. Fred Tucker's voice. I planted that gun in the kid's closet. The voice on the tape said, clear and cold. He's too smart, too dangerous for this place. My son Jimmy can't compete with him at school. I can't let a black kid like him outshine my son. So I made an anonymous call to make it look natural. The people will believe they always do. The hall fell silent. The static of the tape recorder was the only sound for long, drawn-out seconds. Then the shouting erupted like a violent wave. Lies. Billy jumped to his feet, his face flushed, slamming his hand on the chair. You faked that. Mr. Tucker would never say that. But the voice on the tape continued, unfazed. Lena might suspect, but she won't dare say anything. Who will believe her? A black cleaning lady against me? They'll drive the kid away, and it'll be over. Jamal turned off the recorder, put it on the table, and turned to look at Tucker. He sat there, his face pale, his hands shaking uncontrollably. You, Tucker stammered, standing up, pointing at Jamal. You faked that. I never said that. This is a setup. But his voice trailed off, and his eyes, the eyes that had coldly condemned Jamal, were now filled with panic. The crowd began to turn to look at him, not with trust, but with suspicion. Mr. Fred? Mrs. Mary whispered, her crucifix falling to the floor. Is it true? Jamal didn't give Tucker a chance to argue further. I don't need you to believe me, he said, his voice sharp. I just need you to listen. That voice is as you know it better than anyone. And I have other evidence. He took a stack of papers from the briefcase, copies of invoices, records from a pawn shop in Atlanta where Tucker had bought the gun 10 years ago. I found the person who sold it, Jamal said, holding up the papers. He remembers clearly, a tall man, gray hair, from Pine Hollow, bought an old gun and paid in cash. That day was 3 days before the police raided my house. The hall erupted. Shouts, cries, arguments filled the room. Some people stood up, pointing at Tucker, demanding he explain. Others turned to Jamal, shouting that he was a liar, that he was trying to destroy the town. But Jamal stood there, still, his eyes locked on Tucker. He backed away, falling into his chair, his face now as white as paper. You have no right, he muttered, but no one heard. The truth had been exposed, and nothing could hide it anymore. Then Jamal spoke one last time, drowning out the noise of the crowd. You believe him, he said, pointing at Tucker. You threw stones at me, pushed my mother to the ground, drove me away, all because of a lie. I'm not here to ask for your forgiveness. I'm here to make you see what you did and to make you live with it. He turned his back, walked out of the hall, leaving the tape recorder and the papers on the table, like an indelible judgment. Outside, the fog was thicker, obscuring Jamal's figure as he walked away. Inside the hall, the shouts of the crowd gradually subsided, giving way to a heavy silence. Tucker sat there, his head bowed, his trembling hands covering his face. Old man Henry quietly left his seat, walked outside, without saying a word. Mrs. Thompson held her head, muttering, "Were we wrong?" And Billy, his face flushed, punched the wall, but didn't dare to follow Jamal. The secret had been revealed, but it wasn't the end. Jamal knew this truth was just the first step of greater pain. A deeper tragedy awaited, and he wouldn't stop until Pine Hollow faced the full consequences of what they had done. The night after the emergency meeting, Pine Hollow was shrouded in a heavy atmosphere, as if the entire town was holding its breath under the weight of the exposed truth. The wind whistling through the cornfields now carried a different tone, no longer the whisper of nature, but the lament of unearthed memories. The town hall was empty, but Jamal's tape recorder and papers still lay on the table, like an accusation no one dared to touch. The townspeople left in silence, one by one, their eyes lost in a mix of confusion and guilt. But Jamal didn't stop. He knew the truth about the gun was just the beginning a deeper wound. A greater tragedy waited to be uncovered, and he wouldn't leave Pine Hollow until everything was exposed. Jamal returned to the small house on the outskirts, the flickering oil lamp casting shadows on his face, a face no longer holding the composure of the previous days. His eyes were red, not from crying, but from sleepless nights and the simmering pain in his heart. He sat down on the old wooden chair, opened the briefcase, and took out an object he had kept hidden since his return. A handwritten letter, the trembling handwriting of Lena, his mother, sent to Ruth a few months before she passed away. That letter was the final piece he found in Atlanta, in a box of Ruth's belongings after her death. Jamal held it in his hand, his fingers tracing the smudged ink, and for the first time in years, he let tears fall not from weakness, but because the truth in the letter was too cruel for him to bear any longer. The next day, Jamal appeared again, not at the town hall, but at the small cemetery behind Pine Hollow Church. It was where Lena was buried, in a secluded corner with a simple tombstone engraved with Lena Carter 1970 to 2017. Weeds grew around the grave, as if the town had deliberately forgotten her existence. Jamal stood before the grave, holding the letter, his broad shoulders trembling slightly in the cold wind. He wasn't wearing a suit today, just a simple black coat, as if wanting to return to being the 15-year-old boy who had left this place. He knelt down, placed his hand on the tombstone, and whispered, "Mom, I'm back. I'm sorry I wasn't there for you." His voice trailed off, blending with the wind, but no one heard the cemetery was empty, only he and the ghosts of the past. News of Jamal's appearance at the cemetery spread quickly. The townspeople gathered at the church gate, not daring to enter, just watching from a distance. Old man Henry, Mrs. Mary, Mrs. Thompson, familiar faces stood among the crowd, their eyes wavering between curiosity and fear. Billy was also present, hands in his pockets, his face flushed with alcohol, but not daring to speak. They didn't know what Jamal was going to do, but his presence at Lena's grave made them feel uneasy, as if another, deeper secret was about to be brought to light. Then Jamal stood up, turned to face the crowd. He raised the letter high, his voice ringing out, not loud, but enough to penetrate the silence. "You thought it was over with the gun," he said, his eyes locked on each face. "You thought driving me away was everything, but you were wrong. The truth doesn't stop with Fred Tucker, it involves all of you and my mother." He paused, taking a deep breath, trying to suppress the surge of emotions in his heart. "This is the letter my mother wrote before she died. She sent it to my aunt in Atlanta, but I only found it after my aunt passed away. And now, I'm going to read it to you." The crowd was silent, no one daring to speak. Jamal opened the letter, his voice trembling as he read the first lines. Dear Ruth, I don't know how much longer I have to live. After Jamal was driven away, everything here fell apart. The townspeople don't talk to me. No one hires me anymore. They call me the mother of a criminal. They throw trash in my yard. They do everything to make me disappear. He paused, looking up at the crowd, his eyes like burning flames. Do you hear that? You didn't just drive me away, you killed my mother day by day. Whispers arose, but Jamal continued, his voice now stronger, drowning out all other sounds. I went to see Fred Tucker, begging him to tell the truth. I knew he had set everything up. I heard him tell another officer that he planted the gun to drive Jamal away. But he laughed in my face, threatened me. He said if I dared to open my mouth, he would do worse not just to me, but to Jamal. I was scared, Ruth. I couldn't protect my son, and I couldn't protect myself. Jamal paused, his hands gripping the letter so tightly that the paper crumpled. He turned to look at the crowd, his voice dropping, but sharp as a knife. Fred Tucker didn't just plant the gun, he threatened my mother to silence her. And you helped him. You shunned her. You let her work herself to exhaustion. You let her die alone. She didn't die of illness, she died because of you. He pointed at the crowd, his eyes lingering on Henry, who had slapped Lena that day. You, he said, his voice trembling with anger. You hit my mother when she begged for me. Do you think I can forget that? The crowd began to stir. Some people bowed their heads, tears streaming down their cheeks, not from remorse, but because the truth was too heavy to bear. Mrs. Mary covered her face, muttering, Lord, we didn't know. Mrs. Thompson turned away, her shoulders trembling, as if unwilling to face what he said. But others like Billy shouted in protest. You're lying, he yelled, taking a few steps forward before being restrained by others. Your mother was weak. It's not our fault. Don't blame us. Jamal didn't answer. He turned to the tombstone, placed the letter on the ground before his mother's grave, and took another stack of papers from his pocket medical records he had obtained from the hospital near Pine Hollow. This is the final proof, he said, holding it up. My mother died of exhaustion and heart failure, but the doctor noted that she suffered from severe stress for months before that. No one helped her, no one took her to the doctor, no one gave her food when she was hungry. You abandoned her because you believed Fred Tucker more than a black woman begging for justice for her son. Cries echoed from the crowd, this time genuine. An elderly woman, a former neighbor of Lena's, collapsed, sobbing. Lena, I'm sorry, she muttered, but her voice was lost in the wind. Henry stood there, his hands trembling, his eyes empty as if he had lost his soul. But Jamal didn't look at them. He turned back to his mother's grave, knelt down again, and whispered, Mom, I did it. They know the truth now. Fred Tucker wasn't present at the cemetery, but the news quickly reached him. He sat in a small house by the river, holding a bottle of liquor, his face pale with fear. He knew Jamal wouldn't stop, and he knew he couldn't run forever. The townspeople now looked at him differently, no longer the respected police chief, but a liar who had ruined a family's life. But Jamal didn't care about Tucker at that moment. He stood up, walked through the chaotic crowd, and left the cemetery, leaving the letter and medical records on the grave as a permanent reminder of the tragedy that Pine Hollow couldn't erase. That night, Jamal sat in the small house, the oil lamp casting shadows on his face, a face now bearing the scars of the past. He didn't cry anymore, but his hands trembled as he held the notebook, where he wrote the final line. Mom, I showed them. But it's not over. He knew his mother's tragedy was the deepest cut in his heart, but he also knew he could do more, not just to tell the truth, but to change Pine Hollow forever. And the final step, the biggest step, was waiting for him. After the confrontation at the cemetery, Pine Hollow was no longer the quiet town it once was. The winter wind now carried the weight of guilt and truth, seeping through every wooden house, every muddy red dirt road. The townspeople no longer gathered on porches to sip lemonade or chat. They were quieter, avoiding each other's eyes, as if afraid that a single word could reopen the wounds that Jamal Carter had left. Fred Tucker no longer appeared in public. He hid in his house by the river, doors locked, curtains drawn, like a wounded animal waiting for death. But Jamal didn't stop. He had uncovered the secrets, exposed the tragedy, and now it was time for the final shock, a blow that no one in Pine Hollow could have anticipated. The next morning, a large truck appeared on the main road leading into town, followed by a group of strangers in work uniforms. They stopped in front of Pine Hollow High, the old school with faded red brick walls and a weed-filled basketball court. The townspeople stood at a distance, curiously watching the workers begin to erect a large sign in front of the school gate. The sound of hammering echoed dryly in the cold air, and when the sign was finished, the words on it left everyone speechless. Lena Carter Educational Center for Underprivileged Children, regardless of race. Below was a smaller line, funded by Jamal Carter. Whispers spread quickly, but no one dared to step forward and ask. Then Jamal appeared no longer in a black suit or simple coat, but in a gray business suit, holding a thick folder. He stood before the sign, his eyes scanning the crowd that had now gathered, from Old Man Henry with his wrinkled face to Billy with his red eyes. "You thought I came back just to tell the truth?" he said, his voice deep and firm, echoing across the schoolyard. "No, I came back to change this place, to make sure it never forgets my mother and never repeats what you did to us." The crowd was silent, no one daring to speak. Jamal raised the folder, continuing, "For the past 10 years, I haven't just survived. I learned not in classrooms, but from books, from the streets, from the people I met in Atlanta. I worked, I saved, and I built something you can't destroy." He paused, looking straight into their eyes. "I bought this school. Pine Hollow High is now mine. I turned it into a free educational center for underprivileged children, especially children of color, so they don't have to endure what I endured here." The crowd erupted in whispers and shouts. "You have no right," Billy yelled, lunging forward a few steps before being restrained. "This school belongs to us." But Jamal didn't flinch. He took a piece of paper from his pocket, a legal ownership certificate with a clear notary seal. "I have every right," he said, holding up the paper. "I bought it from the county council, with the money I earned from 10 years of hard work. You don't want me here? Well, now you have to live with me, not as a boy driven away, but as someone who owns a part of Pine Hollow." That truth hit the townspeople like a punch in the face. They couldn't believe that Jamal, the boy they had stoned, the boy they had called a criminal, now stood before them with a power they couldn't deny. Mrs. Thompson, who had ignored Jamal's bullying in class, sank into a chair, her hands trembling as she covered her face. "How'd he do it?" she muttered, her voice lost. Old Man Henry stood there, his eyes empty, as if he had lost something he never thought he would lose. And Billy, his face flushed, punched the air, but didn't dare to approach. Jamal's presence was now too large, too overwhelming. Then Jamal turned to the sign, placing his hand on the words Lena Carter. "This is for my mother," he said, his voice dropping, filled with emotion. "She worked herself to death to raise me. She begged you to forgive me, but you abandoned her. Now she will live forever here in every brick, every classroom, every child who walks through this gate. You can't erase her anymore." He paused, took a deep breath, and continued, "I didn't do this to forgive you. I did this to make you remember what you did and live with it for the rest of your lives. The crowd began to stir. Some people cried belated tears, not from remorse, but because they knew they couldn't change the past. An elderly woman, a former neighbor of Lena's, stepped forward, knelt before Jamal, whispering, "I'm sorry, Jamal. I didn't know." But he didn't look at her. He turned away, walked into the school, where the workers were beginning to clean and repair. The sound of hammering, the sound of sawing wood, the sound of the future being built all blended with the cold wind of Pine Hollow. But the final shock didn't stop there. That afternoon, another group of people appeared, not workers, but children and families from neighboring towns, mostly people of color. They came to register for the new educational center, bringing hope in their eyes and shy smiles on their faces. The Pine Hollow townspeople stood at a distance, watching the unfamiliar faces walk through the school gate, faces they had once scorned, once feared. A little boy about 10 years old, with dark skin like Jamal's used to be, ran to the sign, pointed to the words Lena Carter, and asked his mother, "Who was she, Mom?" The mother smiled, answering, "She was a special person, son. She made this place." Jamal stood in the small school office, watching the scene through the window. He didn't cry, but his hands trembled as he held the notebook, the one that had accompanied him through all the pain. He opened it, looked at the last lines Mama showed them. But it's not over. Now, he crossed out the word not, replacing it with a new word, over. He closed the notebook, put it on the table, and for the first time in 10 years, he felt relief not from forgiveness, but because he had fulfilled his vow. News of the educational center spread beyond Pine Hollow. Local newspapers began to write about it, calling Jamal the mysterious man who changed the town. But he didn't care about fame. The next day, he left Pine Hollow not on the rundown bus like 10 years ago, but in the shiny black car that had brought him here. He didn't look back, didn't say goodbye. He left the educational center as a legacy, a permanent reminder of his mother and what the town had done. The Pine Hollow townspeople didn't know whether to be proud or ashamed. Some people began to visit the center, bringing food or old books as a way of belated atonement. Others, like Billy, still growled in the garage, but didn't dare to vandalize. They knew Jamal had left something bigger than they could destroy. Fred Tucker, in his house by the river, heard the news on the radio, his trembling hands dropping the bottle of liquor on the floor. He didn't leave his house anymore, and a few months later, he was found dead in loneliness. No one attended his funeral. Pine Hollow changed forever. The Lena Carter Center became a place where hundreds of children found opportunity, black children, white children, brown children, all mingling in laughter and study. The sign in front of the school still stood, the words from my mother, Lena Carter, silently telling the story of a boy driven away and a man who returned to claim justice. Jamal never returned, but his name and his mother's name lived on in that town as a final shock they couldn't forget. Jamal Carter's story is not just a personal journey. It is a mirror reflecting the hidden corners of society, where discrimination, injustice, and hatred can destroy the life of an innocent person. From a 15-year-old boy with big dreams in an old notebook, Jamal was driven out of Pine Hollow, a small but prejudiced town, simply because of his skin color and a fabricated lie. 10 years of exile, the loss of his mother, and extreme loneliness transformed him from a victim into a man with unbreakable strength. The first meaning of the story lies in resilience, not the resilience of muscles or weapons, but of the soul, of the relentless will to seek justice. Jamal did not succumb to the stones thrown at him or the curses that cut through his heart. He stood up, moved on, and eventually returned to confront those who had despised him. It is a reminder that No matter how unfair life is, people can still find light in the darkness, as long as they do not give up on themselves. But this story is not just about victory, it is also a profound tragedy about what was lost. Lena Carter, the devoted mother who sacrificed everything for her son, became a silent victim of discrimination and oppression. She did not die of ordinary illness, but the invisible wounds that Pine Hollow carved into her soul, the alienation, the threats, the extreme loneliness after Jamal was driven away. The meaning here is a warning. Injustice not only destroys the person who directly suffers it, but also spreads like an undercurrent, sweeping away the dearest loved ones. Jamal could return and change Pine Hollow, but he could not bring his mother back. That pain is permanent. The price he and Lena had to pay for the hatred of a blind community. Through this, the story raises a haunting question. Do we recognize the wounds we inflict on others before it is too late? Another layer of meaning in the story lies in revenge, not through violence, but through meaningful action. Jamal did not choose to burn down Pine Hollow or retaliate with his fists. He chose to build, transforming the school where he was bullied into an educational center named after his mother. This is not just a personal victory, but a powerful declaration. What was destroyed can be reborn, and those who cause suffering must live with the legacy of the person they harmed. The Lena Carter Center is not just a place of learning for underprivileged children, it is a permanent scar on the conscience of Pine Hollow, a reminder that they cannot erase the past with silence or indifference. This meaning teaches us that revenge does not necessarily mean destroying the enemy, but can mean rising above them, turning pain into strength to change the world. The story is also a sharp critique of prejudice and the cowardice of the crowd. The people of Pine Hollow were not all as evil as Fred Tucker, but they all contributed to the tragedy of Jamal and Lena through their silence, through believing lies without questioning, through turning their backs on a desperate mother. Henry slapped Lena. Thompson ignored Jamal's bullying. Billy threw stones, but even those who did not directly act were guilty, because they let fear and prejudice guide them. The meaning here is a painful lesson. Indifference is as dangerous as evil, and the crowd can become a tool of injustice if no one dares to stand up for the truth. Pine Hollow was not just judged by Jamal, they judged themselves when they faced the consequences of what they had done. The first lesson drawn from the story is the power of patience and determination. Jamal did not rush to take revenge immediately after being expelled. He waited, learned, and prepared for 10 years. He turned pain into motivation, loneliness into strength, and finally returned with a plan no one could stop. This teaches us that, in life, it is not always necessary to react immediately to injustice sometimes. Patience is the most powerful weapon, allowing us to rebuild from the ashes and defeat the enemy in ways they do not expect. Jamal did not need to shout or fight. He just stood there, with the educational center named after his mother, and Pine Hollow collapsed under the weight of their guilt. The second lesson is about the value of not forgetting the past. Jamal did not forgive Pine Hollow, and he did not need to forgive, but he also did not let the past swallow him. Instead, he turned it into a tool. The notebook, his mother's letter, the painful memories all became weapons for him to reclaim justice. Life sometimes forces us to endure wounds that cannot heal, but how we face them defines who we are. Jamal teaches us that not forgetting does not mean living in hatred, but using the past to create a better future, not just for ourselves, but for others, like the children who walk through the gates of the Lena Carter Center. The third lesson is about the responsibility of each individual in a community. Pine Hollow did not just have Fred Tucker as the villain. Every citizen, from Henry to Mary, contributed to the tragedy by their silence or actions. They believed the lies because it was easy, because it fit their prejudices, and they never asked themselves if they were wrong. This reminds us that in life, we cannot shirk responsibility by blaming others. Every word, every action, even every act of indifference has consequences. If only one person in Pine Hollow had stood up to protect Jamal and Lena, perhaps the story would have been different. We must learn to ask questions, listen, and act for justice, even when it means standing alone. Finally, the story brings a lesson about hope, not naive hope, but hope forged through suffering. Jamal did not return to reconcile with Pine Hollow. He returned to change it, to ensure that other children did not suffer as he did. The Lena Carter Center is a symbol of that hope, a place where underprivileged children, especially children of color, can dream without being crushed, can learn without being despised. It teaches us that no matter how cruel life is, we can still sow seeds of hope for others, turning personal pain into community strength. Jamal did not just take revenge, he created a legacy, and that is his greatest victory. Jamal Carter's story ends not with reconciliation or forgiveness, but with an unchangeable truth. Pine Hollow will forever bear the mark of him and his mother. The educational center stands there in the town that once expelled him as a permanent reminder of the price of discrimination and the power of resilience. Its deepest meaning lies in the fact that we cannot erase the past, but we can learn from it and thereby change the future. Jamal leaves, but he leaves behind a Pine Hollow that will never be the same, a town forced to confront itself and thereby find a path, however late, to redemption. The final lesson is, no matter how deep the darkness, light can still be lit not by magic, but by the will of people.